couple of days ago, Neil Kashkari, who's the president of the CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, sort of like, I think, gave a little bit away of the game of what the Fed is doing. I mean, he's generally like a so-called dove when it comes to inflation. Now he's become a little bit hawkish. So much of this is really about like our government refusing to take steps that could deal with inflation. I even think like the Biden administration has some arrows in its quiver to deal with inflation, but they don't want to because of the nature of our system in this country. They don't want to hurt, and corporations and wealthy people really control the way that the government reacts to these things. Here is Katie Porter arguing about what is contributing to inflation with a friend of show, I feel comfortable saying, Mike Conzel, who is testifying.
According to this chart, what is the biggest driver of inflation during the pandemic? The dark blue is the recent period.
It would be corporate profits.
And what is that percentage?
It is 54%, and that number does stay that level of high if you update that number to more recent numbers as well.
So over half of the increased prices people are paying are coming from increases in corporate profits.
Yes, the unit price index is reflected in corporate profits as opposed to other costs.
And how does that compare to historically to other periods of inflation or over other periods of economic time?
As reflected there and in other analysis, it is significantly higher in this recovery, 11.5%.
And what is it today?
53%.
So I want to make sure everyone in America understands this chart. What is a unit labor cost?
The cost, wages and associated work costs.
So we could just wages. What is a non-labor input cost?
A variety of things, including maintenance and investments.
Okay, so I have to buy the stuff to make the widget. I have to have a factory. I have to keep the lights on. I have to hire someone to make the widget. That's this stuff. And this is what I add on top.
Hold up that chart, and you'll see unit labor costs incredibly low relative to where there has been on average, relatively speaking, in terms of what is contributing to the prices. Corporate profits, the biggest element of this.
Not wage growth?
Kashkari, even in this Bloomberg piece, the inflation didn't come from the labor market. This inflation came from supply chains and energy and commodities. He won't say corporate profits. Do we actually have a tight labor market? One way I would define tight labor market is labor is in a relatively strong position and their share of the pie is growing. Their share of the pie is shrinking. So I don't know. They don't want to point out what Katie Porter is pointing out here. We are looking at two different things that are happening. One is we have a massive disruption in our supply chain that is still rippling through the system. And two is corporations are taking this opportunity to price gouge. Mm-hmm. This is, you can imagine being in a town or a city that has just been hit by a hurricane. Cost of everything is going to go up because maybe the bridge is out. They can't get, they have to drive around the other way. Smaller trucks have to come. There's not as much stuff at the store. Maybe one of the stores, the electricity broke and the refrigerators spoiled all the food and whatnot. And then on top of that, imagine that one of these shopkeepers is like, this is a good opportunity for me. I've got a lot of water in the basement, to be honest with you, but this is a good opportunity for me to charge 4 times what I normally charge for a bottle of water. That's what's going on here.
Yeah.
That's what's going on.
So what is the tool that the Fed could use in theory to discipline corporate America? Because all you hear Powell talking about is softening labor market conditions, and he's been raising interest rates, and that still hasn't made enough of a dent because the corporations are still gouging.
The way that they're doing this, because the Fed has limited tools. The way that the Fed is doing this is we are going to hurt workers enough that their consumer ability is so low that it convinces corporations that they can't now price gouge anymore. It's basically like saying we're going to use the workers not so much as a hammer, but as almost like a tool to pry corporate grip around these prices loose. The only other way that our government could address this, and there's only so much that can be done, period.
Taxation?
No.
Well, we can't do that.
Well, you could tax corporate profits. That would be helpful, because if they're not going to see these profits, then and they're going to suffer in terms of volume sales, but they're not going to see the profits that are associated with it, right? Because and there was a story about this actually in ProPublica about what's happening in the housing market. There is a software that's being used by something like now half or 3/4 of the management companies in this country with big ownership, where they're using an algorithm that basically says, like, you can leave apartments vacant. In fact, in this city, apparently, like 10% of the rent control apartments are vacant right now. And this algorithm will show you that you can drive up rents, increase in rents, even though you're keeping apartments vacant. Part of it is you are creating a scarcity of the product. It's basically price gouging.
I mean, it's like you used to, in order to price fix, have to have like a nice dinner or lunch or something with all the other capitalists in your community, but now you just subscribe to an algorithm.
Exactly. In fact, someone in that piece said the best way to think of this is, instead of thinking of the software, say a guy named Bob. And a guy named Bob told us to raise prices.
Bob will tell you, yeah.
And Bob said to raise it 3 percentage points or whatever.
Think about like a Sopranos mafia meeting, but it's just the algorithm.
Right. And the way that our government could do this, Richard Nixon did it very reluctantly, establish price controls. Also wage controls too, but since wages are lagging behind prices at this point, putting a wage and price control structure, imposing it 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, whatever it is, that should happen. Nixon pioneered this. I heard an interesting podcast about like where the idea came from that was floating around. It wasn't his idea. In fact, he ran on arguing against it. It was coming out of World War II. This was into the Kennedy administration. This idea was kicking around, and he didn't want this to happen. But he ended up realizing like this needs to happen. The
executive branch can just do it, or they need Congress.
Apparently under certain like emergency powers, you can do it without Congress's approval.
Let's go then.
In fact, on some level, I think it was to thwart Congress from doing it. Where they would have been a little bit more. Remember, that was a Democratic dominated Congress, and it would have put him on the hot seat. And I think he just sort of like, I don't know if it was like a limited hangout type of situation, but you could do price controls, and you could also do taxation. You'd have to go through Congress. You could do some type of windfall profit taxation, which would basically get rid of the incentive for creating such massive profits. Rather, they'll make their money through volume instead of huge price gouging markups. But we are so, like, even this guy who realizes it's not wages, he can't say corporate profits, even though he knows it. This is the dirty little secret. And so the Fed does the only thing it can do, which is to use basically citizens, workers, in their capacity as consumers, as basically a tool to sort of like slowly, gently convince corporate CEOs that they can't get away with price gouging anymore.
Don't you love being used as leverage in a standoff between corporate America?
Well, especially when
and the
corporate
United
America's
States?
like, oh no, everyone's going to be motivated to come work for us now.
Yeah.
Oh, don't do us like that. Like,
Right.
I mean,
Right. It's a win-win for them. Right. Tails I win, heads you lose.
Yep.